Is supporting Ukraine, to fight the war, the same thing as actually supporting Ukraine?
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. We're going to be talking about Donald Trump and Ukraine, of course. I say of course because everybody seems to be pulling their hair out at Donald Trump's latest statements on resolving the Ukraine conflict. Peace is on the cards, but Donald Trump has got into a war of words with Vladimir Zelensky, which culminated last night in a Truth Social post in which he called Zelensky a failure, he called Europe a failure, and he has been accused in recent days of saying that Ukraine started the war. I'm not sure that's fair, but we'll get into that in a bit. I'm delighted to be joined now by Sergey Radchenko, who is a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a Spectator contributor and has posted a piece which has gone up today on this subject, as well as by Owen Matthews, the Spectator's Russia correspondent. Sergey, I'll start with you. Give us your reaction to Trump's latest outburst first.
Well, the reaction is that of outrage. I don't know how else you could react to something like this. And I understand, I'm a moderate. I think that this war is going to have to have a negotiated solution. I mean, I authored a piece with Sam Cherp a few years ago about Istanbul talks and how a negotiated solution, what it might look like. But I think even if we are talking about negotiating, even if it's understandable that America perhaps needs to look elsewhere, it's got interests in the Indo-Pacific and has to confront China. Still, the way that Trump conducts his diplomacy to me is absolutely outrageous. He is not consulting with his allies. He's effectively betraying Ukraine. He's calling President Zelensky a dictator. He has totally bought into Putin's narrative about what's happening in Ukraine. And in my view, his values basically align with Putin's. He's thinking of the world as a world of empires, a world divided into spheres of influence. And in that world, it seems that there is really no place for an independent Ukraine. It has to fall into somebody's sphere of influence. And to me, it seems like Trump has already decided that it should be Putin's. That's at least, I don't know how else to interpret it as commentary.
In your piece, it's a very well-written piece, you say that you call it a foul deal, Trump's foul Ukrainian deal. The deal hasn't been struck yet. Are you being a bit premature, dare I say it, in calling the deal foul?
I am perhaps being a little bit premature. What I'm seeing is Trump going into this deal or into the negotiations, hoping to achieve a deal along basically establishing a line of control or basically freezing the conflict along the established line of control and offering Russia massive incentives, maybe lifting sanctions and so on. And he's hoping that Putin will come along and play along. But what we have seen from the talks in Riyadh that just took place between the Russians and the Americans is that the Russians are not in any hurry and they're playing to a different time frame compared to Trump. Trump wants something urgent. He wants a quick fix. He wants to get out of this. Putin is playing for the long haul. He did not start this war for a little strip of land in eastern Donbass. He is much more interested in imposing control of over Ukraine, and he thinks that the winds are blowing into his sails. So I worry that when you have these two different positions that come into contact with one another, with one of the negotiators basically essentially trying to get out as quickly as he can, the result will be a foul deal for Ukraine. That's what I'm worried about.
Oh, and you've also written several excellent pieces for The Spectator on this subject of late, and your most recent one touches on, I think, a very interesting element of this story, which is the Trump-Zelensky relationship, which goes back to Trump's first term and his impeachment, when Zelensky was the new president. Trump was, of course, impeached over a phone call with Zelensky in which he appeared to be offering a kind of quid pro quo for American military aid in exchange for dirt on Joe Biden. But the two men now have made very public their differences, and they seem to be in a kind of war of words. And you suggest that Zelensky has made a big mistake in engaging in that war of words, don't you?
Yes, unfortunately, I think Zelensky has made a terrible mistake, and I realize that that sounds somewhat like victim blaming, but actually, Trump was always going to be Zelensky's biggest relationship in terms of importance, and is most difficult and challenging in terms of their backstory, because it's clear that Trump has an axe to grind going right the way back to the Hunter Biden laptop and all the Rudy Giuliani scandals and all the quid pro quo phone calls, all of that stuff. He's still very angry about Russiagate. And the way that Zelensky chose to play it over the last week has, in the words of Vice President J.D. Vance, essentially just hacked off Trump on a personal level. As J.D. Vance says, I know Trump very well. That's not the way to deal with him. Because what Zelensky had been doing was basically, he accused Trump of living in a disinformation bubble. He complained publicly about not being invited to the Riyadh summit, and then promised to literally show up uninvited to Riyadh. I mean, that would have been extraordinarily undiplomatic. There was, clearly that post on Truth Social, which blew up the Trump-Zelensky relationship, was clearly written in a moment of, personal high anger and pique, and clearly this is an absolutely terrible way for a superpower to conduct its international diplomacy. That's just crazy and irresponsible and crass. And however much you might actually agree with some of the points that Trump made, specifically about Zelensky's democratic legitimacy and so on, to actually just sort of blast him in that barely coherent manner, sort of slightly undermines the actually often, largely factually true points that Trump made. So that's the issue is, sadly, that now that relationship is very broken, and I fear that that's going to be very dangerous and expensive for Ukraine to pick up those pieces now.
Isn't Trump essentially just recognizing, of course, through exaggerations and lies or half lies, that Zelensky is a busted flush? I mean, yes, Trump is exaggerating how low his approval ratings are, but it looks as though he would probably lose an election were Ukraine to hold one. And so, therefore, he's, in treating him in the way he has, it's not very nice. It's pretty unpleasant, but it's not necessarily stupid.
The bottom line is, there's a great phrase in Russian, "Худой мир лучше доброй ссоры." Like, a thin peace is better than a fat war. Frankly, I think if Trump manages to bring the conflict to an end, he will actually ultimately be doing Ukraine a favor, for one very simple reason, because justice and peace in this end game of the war are not compatible. You can either have justice, in other words, you keep fighting, or you can have peace, in which case you have to stop fighting, and that will be unjust. I mean, those two things unfortunately exist. It's a zero-sum game. They're equal but opposite. So I think the practical on-the-ground danger is that Ukraine is facing the possibility of a military collapse. And that was something that Kirill Budanov, the highly competent head of Ukraine's military intelligence, told a closed session of parliament. And that was leaked, much to his own annoyance, and that kind of proves that that's true. So that being the case, if fighting on actually could lead to a much more serious military collapse than is current, the much worse military situation that they currently have, or even worse, then ultimately, actually, pretty much anything it takes to get to a ceasefire is ultimately going to be helpful to Ukraine, unjust as it is. And that leads us to another question: is setting aside the fact that Trump is deeply misinformed. He's insulting. He, has made various, errors in his tirades over the last couple of days about Zelensky. But the bottom line is, can he get this done? And if he can't get it done, then who can? And I think there is still, quite a lot of momentum, or it's still, I think factually true that Trump has by far the best chance of ending this, and a much better chance than the Europeans ever have done. So, that's essentially what I'm saying is that peace is its own reward, and at the moment, if Trump can get Ukraine to that place where there is a ceasefire, then I think that would actually really be more valuable than any kind of amount of pro-Zelensky sort of pieties and posturing from the Europeans, because so far they've not actually delivered either peace or justice.
I take your point about the crassness of the language, and it's not really the way a superpower should behave. But it strikes me that we're back to a situation with Trump, anyway, that we were in 2017, where he says outrageous things on social media, and the political and media classes tear their hair out and say how outrageous it is. And that's going back to the way things were in Trump's first term. It's not actually how things have been so far in the very short space of time we've had of Trump's second term. But the reality is that the media are still twisting what he says, for instance, or deliberately misreading, one might say. For instance, he told reporters on Tuesday that he used the word, "you should never have started it," talking about Zelensky. But if you read the full quote, he was clearly referring there to thwarted attempts to achieve a peace deal early on in 2022. And this has been taken as Trump saying to Zelensky that Ukraine started the war. He didn't, if you really think about what he was trying to mean there, he didn't really say that.
Well, except in his Truth Social, he actually literally does say the opposite. He actually just doubles down on that and says this war should never have been fought in the first place. So I think he kind of does.
Yes,
but you're right. He's not accusing Zelensky of starting it. That's true.
But when he says this war should never be started, what he's talking about, it's a vain thought, but it's probably true. Is he saying, if I had been president, it never would have started? That's something he says a lot.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So you're right. His words have been twisted, but I mean that's very unsurprising given the sort of media landscape and climate and the polarization. I mean, sort of the foxification of American news. Going the fact that Roger Ailes actually, of Fox News pioneered the mixing of opinion and reporting and so on. I mean, I think that's just a sort of malaise of the American political system. I mean, but you're also right that these pieties pertain. There's been a lot of groupthink in Europe and Britain as well, particularly in Britain, strangely enough, because Britain is curiously the only country in the Western world that I can think of which has been where there's been absolutely no domestic opposition to support for Ukraine. There's been huge opposition in France, in Germany, the AfD, in Italy. There's the Liga. I mean, even the sort of government coalition partners are skeptical. In America, obviously, we've got the Republicans. Only in Britain, only we are in a position where we're just foursquare behind Ukraine. I mean, that's wonderful, but I think that it's preventing us from, from asking now a hard question: is supporting Ukraine, to fight the war, the same thing as actually supporting Ukraine? Because I think those things are becoming different. That actually to encourage and push Ukraine into fighting on, which is what Zelensky seems to be rallying support for. In other words, how will we continue to fight on without the United States supporting us? And who's with me in Europe? Apparently, so far only Keir Starmer. But I think that there are real serious questions to be asked about, like how sensible a policy that is, and why Zelensky is sort of is fixated on this. I think he is profoundly personally invested, obviously, in the war. He has a very good claim to be like the savior of Ukraine. I mean, that's really not even an exaggeration. I mean, his personal involvement is, I think, sort of almost unprecedented in the history of modern warfare, of like, one leader and his example and his diplomacy, sort of rallying his country and then galvanizing massive international support. That was all Zelensky. I mean, that's pretty heroic, on a sort of, national heroic scale. Now, I think there is a legitimate question to be asked, whether crassly or not, about whether Zelensky is the person to conclude a peace. And I think a lot of people in Kiev, certainly the last time I was there, just before earlier this winter, was saying that, frankly, Valery Zaluzhny, as a former general, as the former commander in chief of the Ukraine's armed forces before he was sacked by Zelensky, he's now Ukraine's ambassador in London. He's leading the polls. Someone like Zaluzhny with this absolutely unimpeachable military tradition. He's a soldier. He's comes from a military family. He's absolutely four square, no questions asked, Ukrainian patriot. That's the kind of guy that can really do a deal with Putin. He's a fresh face. He doesn't sort of have the baggage. So just in terms of practicalities, perhaps indeed Trump is right that actually it's peace belongs to a sort of post-Zelensky era.
Yes. And on that point, in those early months of the war, Zelensky was obviously propelled to sort of global superstardom. He was called a 21st century Churchill, and he was garlanded with all sorts of awards and honours and so on. Hollywood celebrities were desperate to meet him. It was obviously a little bit over the top, and we didn't ever really have a frank and fair assessment of Zelensky's government. But we do know that Trump isn't entirely wrong in suggesting that lots of money that was given in military aid has gone missing. Indeed, Zelensky had to fire quite a lot of his cabinet at some stage because of the corruption was so bad. His leadership is not beyond reproach.
That's true. There's been a lot of questions concerning the business activities of the circle around his chief of staff, his effective consigliere Andrei Yermak, and who was Zelensky's business partner, in fact, before the war, and in fact before they went into politics. In fact, he was an entertainment lawyer, and Zelensky's government is actually strongly composed of people who he was in business with on the entertainment side before the war. Yes, there are gigantic rumors of epic corruption. Does that mean that we shouldn't have defended Ukraine? I don't think so. I think we should have. I think it was right and proper to defend Ukraine. The question is now, what is actually going to help Ukraine remain independent, free, democratic? That's really what and the first plank of that sort of independent, free, democratic is at peace. Then sort of somehow stem the economic disaster, because right now Ukraine's GDP has fallen by an estimated at least 40%. 40%. That's like catastrophic. That's like post Soviet Union collapse type figures, in fact worse. You have devastation beyond unprecedented since World War II. Literally, I mean, it's just orders of magnitude bigger than Yugoslavia or anything that Europe has seen since World War II. You've got massive brain drain. You've the men of the country have basically been locked inside Ukraine. They have not been allowed to leave for 3.5 years. I think the moment they open the borders, there's going to be another massive exodus of people post-war. So Ukraine faces enormous challenges. Does sort of show trials, truth and reconciliation, putting people in jail for corruption, is that going to help Ukraine? I don't know. That's a question I think for the Ukrainians themselves to answer. But the bottom line and the stage that we're at right now is just getting to peace, and I think it's devastatingly obvious that the peace will involve partition. I mean, because what's the alternative to partition? Is fighting to force Putin to give back the land. Well, we've been trying to do that for 3.5 years. It hasn't worked. Last major Ukrainian advance was in October of 2022. So the outcome is pretty clear. The thing that's not clear is how Ukraine's security can be guaranteed going forward, and what kind of what can we do to make sure that Putin doesn't come back for more chunks of Ukraine. And that's something that's going to be Trump's major challenge after the ceasefire is brokered.
As you say, peace is the imperative now for all moral people, I would think. And Trump, while he's said many wrong or crude things, he's also always said he just wants people to stop dying. And it seems to me that's a more civilized position than a lot of voices in Europe about the Ukraine war.
Well, actually, yes. I mean, it's something that actually has really, really, I find really striking and makes me very indignant and angry. Actually, is people who are willing to fight to the last drop of someone else's blood. They, and I think that's pretty universal for European politicians, is paying lip service and signaling their virtue by saying we must fight Ukraine we must give Ukraine everything they need. What they need is for you personally to go there, sign up, and fight. That's what they need. They need bodies. If you think that, if you want to give them what they need, give them yourself. I mean, it's sorry, this sounds like specious, but I mean, frankly, the major problem with Ukraine is, I mean, they have a problem with ammunition and guns and armor and so on. But actually, it's primarily they're burning through manpower, and actually a major part of the government's credibility is being burned up by this sort of steady drumbeat, increasing drumbeat of sort of press gang type sort of forcible recruitments, which is actually quite, it's hard to assess how damaging it is. But let's say conservatively, for a significant section of Ukrainian society, they find the fact that they are they can't go out on the streets, or they're terrified of having their husbands and fathers essentially sort of snatched off the street by these violent gangs and forced into recruitment centers, often to have bribes extracted, by the way. I mean, there have been several reports, even including most lately last week, of people like being beaten to death in Ukrainian recruitment centers for allegedly refusing to give a bribe to the recruitment officer to let them off. I mean, that's so I think that there's a major disconnect between the reality of Ukrainians who I think are getting very frustrated with the stalemate and would just want it to end, and the European politicians who, for essentially sort of ideological reasons, just continue to push the Ukrainians to fight and fight and fight, while actually not really, while not being willing to help them themselves.
Owen and Sergey, it's fascinating to have your insights. Thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV.